You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
Try to slice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood art Ed me?
Yeah. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today we're going to be talking about Nicolas de Staël. Hopefully I got that pronunciation right. And I am super excited because actually my guest this week is has a bit of a collection of artwork by de Staël, among others. So I'm going to get a little bit of information from somebody who actually had family that knew the artist and has some of the work and some unique insights into it. So without further ado, welcome Patrick Quéré.
Hello, thank you for having me. Thanks.
Oh, thank you so much. Like I said, I'm super excited to get the insights from somebody who had much closer knowledge to the subject. For listeners, Nicolas de Staël was a French painter, but kind of Russian born, I believe, who was rising to prominence in the early to mid 20th century. I mean, he was born 1914, World War II era is when he was really on the rise in the Parisian art scene. Am I right there?
You're correct. His artistic studies, when he was exiled from Russia during the revolution and everything, he was adopted by a wealthy industrialist in Belgium, where he attended art school there, and then wanting to go to the Parisian art scene. Then World War II broke out. He joined the French Foreign Legion for just about a year, but then France capitulated. And so then he was back to being a starving artist again. And his paintings during that time, immediately following World War II, they were very dark and extremely abstract. But later on is when his paintings became more colorful. And as we know him today, if you saw his different oeuvres, his earlier stuff, it was unrecognizable. But he first started painting icons like Russian icons of saints and ecclesiastical figures and whatnot. And then he shifted then he also did, at that same time, he also did landscapes, very somewhat realistic landscapes. And then moving towards very rayonistic, abstract compositions, and then moving more towards but those compositions were very dark. And that was in the mid 40s. And then around 1948 is when he changed his oeuvre to large blocks of color, very bright, very bold, landscapes, figurative, some portraiture as well.
Yeah, see, and that's interesting because I think, for me, if I'm being 100% honest, he's one of those artists whose names I had heard and kind of seen in the art history survey courses, but usually in those kinds of overviews, you get just a quick shot of like a couple of the most famous works from the most famous styles. So like I always thought of him as just these big blocks of color, very like mid-century modern, almost non-objective, where it becomes about the color and the texture. And like I think of almost, I would compare it to like a Hans Hofmann, the push-pull of the colors, the put side by side in the juxtaposition. But as you tell it, there's a little bit more of an evolution of styles happening there, which of course makes perfect sense. I mean, every artist starts off one way and then they learn and they adapt and they evolve. But I had always just pictured him as doing these sort of blocky, abstracted works. And the thing that really piqued my interest, though, was when you said that there's almost like a form of encryption happening with his works. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, because I want to, leave a little teaser out there for people. But you have this insight into it because your family history, you said you actually came to know him not through the art history classes, but through studying your own family history. And that was a story I found absolutely fascinating. Can you talk about how de Staël came to know your, was it grandparents?
My great-grandparents, Kyle.
Great-grandparents. Go ahead.
Yes. So also my grandparents. and to a lesser degree, my father as well, but he was a toddler at the time. Now, what happened was, and this is what I was told, I only knew him by the name of Nicolas, like Nikola Tesla. I didn't know his last name. I just knew him by Nicola, and that he had a wife who was sick, and that my great-grandparents helped him out during post-war World War II in Paris, which is an extremely austere and difficult place because of the scarcity of food, the scarcity of common items, toiletries, medicine, things of that nature. So his wife, Janine Guillot, who passed away in 1946 in the winter, February of 1946. I believe she was born in 1909. She was a little older than Nicholas, and she had tuberculosis. And so the stories that I got from my grandparents, and even to an extent to my father and a few of my aunts, even though they were toddlers at the time, still we talk, that she was always skeletal in appearance. She eventually, starvation was a contributing factor to her demise. That she had, but my great grandfather, he was just under a general in World War I, so he had a lot of connections. He was a restaurateur. His name was Felix or Felix, and he was able to get things on the black market. And he was able to survive, and his friends were able to survive too during that time in Paris. So he was able to help them out. Why he took pity on them, why my great-grandparents did, I don't know. Maybe starving artists or whatever, but it happens. We do acts of kindness all the time, every day. That's what makes us human. So, but that's essentially it as far as the early stories of how they came to know her and him, and that when she passed away, one anecdote that my grandfather told me that he was given these, my great-grandparents were given these ampules of vitamin A, and that there were glass ampules that he had to take a razor blade to cut the top off to put a syringe in, and that she was receiving vitamin A injections. And that was so detailed, and that was so spot on to having tuberculosis, because that's the frontline treatment of that time for TB was vitamin A injections. So also somewhat anecdotal that she passed away after an abortion. Right after Janine died, Nicholas was deeply distraught. He was sitting at my grandparents' restaurant, which I believe was called Le Dauphin, and upstairs they lived upstairs. But so he was sitting there, he was deeply distraught, and he was taking cigarettes out of his cigarette pack, and he started eating them, just eating one after the other, and then he just kind of flipped out. I heard he grabbed the knife, and my great-grandfather took a big pot of water, cold water, dumped it on his head. And my grandfather and my great-grandfather both held him like this and tackled him and waited until he mellowed out from that. But that's the only story I have, basically, when, during the early mid 1940s. The only other story I have when he entered into my family's lives again was in 1953. It was his last exhibit in Paris.
I think that seems like a good little cliffhanger. We'll do the cut to ads, and we'll find out about that last exhibit and a little bit more about the work that Nicolas did I say? Nicolas de Staël gave your great-grandparents.
In 1953, the last time that my family saw Nicholas, it was a chance encounter, and it was completely unrelated. And what happened was this. My grandfather was friends with the African-American artist Edward Clark, otherwise known as Ed Clark. He was from Louisiana. Yeah. I have two of his compositions from 1952, which he painted as a student at the Academy de la Grande Chaumières in Paris. A chaumière is like a thatched roof. It's a famous art school. It's still there today. So I have two of his paintings. One of them was actually painted in the back of our restaurant, which is a series. It's garbage cans, an umbrella, and a pair of Ed Clark's slippers that have paint on them. And the other one is moviegoers, which is people entering and leaving a busy Montparnasse movie theater at nighttime. So I have both of those, which later became his monumental work, The City. It's this huge painting, which later became The City. So in a way, it's not a study because it's a painting, but in a way it led to that. Ed was, Ed served in World War II, and he was in France, and he learned some French. My grandfather was learning some English. He learned some English. He fought with Patton when he went up through Sicily and everything with the Free French. He was fighting with Patton, so he learned some English there. So they had a bond. And he would come into our restaurant all the time and eat because it was right across the street and a couple rows down from that art school, the Grand Chaumière. So he befriended him. And my grandfather took him, my grandfather John, he took Ed to see Nicolas's last exhibit in Paris in 1953. And it was immediately after that last exhibit that he went back to my great-grandparents' house and restaurant, and he gave them that painting because my great-grandpa Felix commented on it, and even other people commented on it. Oh, well, why does this interest you? Why do you always carry this painting around? You know, we always see you with this painting. Why? You know, and he never really elaborated, but since they commented on it, and it was still in his mind 5 years later, and then the chance encounter of seeing my grandfather at his last, exhibit, and then for him to walk over and bring it to them, it's just so incredible when you think about it.
Wow. So that's really interesting. So he had that painting that your great grandfather had seen him with the small painting years ago, and then remembered seeing it in like 1953. And that's how you got this painting. And so that provides me a tremendous segue to ask, what is this painting and what makes it so special? Like, why did he carry it around?
In the mid to late 40s, and I believe it was in 1948 when he first started this piece, it was a small painting about this big, a little bit larger than a smartphone. And it was of a seascape of Le Havre, which is a coastal town in northern part of France in Normandy. And the color of the seascape is a chromium oxide green, because in Le Havre, the coast, the Seine, which is freshwater, it's a freshwater river, it empties into the Atlantic Ocean, creating brackish water. The algae thrives under such conditions and creates that color green. So, and then he started changing it around, adding to it, and he always kept this little painting with him, kept adding to it. He would put it in his pocket. He'd carry it around like a child with a doll or something, just like a security blanket or something. Just carry it with him, always add to it. And he just, changed it. He even changed the configuration of the painting because the size of the painting is a French Marine size #2. Which essentially is 24 centimeters by 14 centimeters. But he cut the stretcher bars down to make it 21.5 centimeters and keeping the 14 centimeters. So why go through all this trouble to just trim it less than 1 inch? And what it eventually evolved into, and I'll show you now, is this little tiny seascape. And it is pixelated. I mean, this is practically pixels before pixels.
Yeah.
So it's made up of approximately, there's 20 rows of approximately 12 squares. And each square is about 1 square centimeter of 240 squares. Now, anyone who's seen the ocean real rough and everything, you see the white crests of the waves. So this is a very rough and tumultuous sea. The color of the sea is a cobalt blue, which is of Antibes. In Antibes, it is very cobalt blue. You have Côte d'Azur, and we can barely see right here that chromium oxide green of the underpainting, and you can see the missing tack because he trimmed this down after he sawed the stretcher bars. You can see the saw marks here and here on the bottom, and it's also like that there and there. This is a little bandage because one day he was very upset with himself and he stabbed this painting with his palette knife. And then he bandaged out of self-loathing and everything. And then out of remorse, he bandaged it back up. He slapped this little bandage of canvas there. But first, he painted it red on the inside of the bandage to resemble his blood, like he hurt himself. And he put a Band-Aid on his boo-boo. You can't see it, but very, very, you have to zoom in and you can see it in images I sent you, Kyle. But it's definitely there. Now, interestingly enough, I thought, well, why go through all this trouble to saw this down, to pop out the tacks, to trim the canvas, to restretch the canvas, to reassemble the stretcher bars, to put in tacks and everything? Why go through all this trouble? Well, I looked at the measurements. 21.5 centimeters is the new measurement, right? Well,
yeah.
Since this painting's made up of squares, the square of a number is always raised to the power of 2. So if I multiply the new length of this, it's 21.5 times 2 equals 43. And you divide the width, which is 14, it equals 7. The latitude and longitude coordinates of Antibes is 43 degrees north by 7 degrees east. This is not a non sequitur. This was deliberate. So now, since I have the painting here, let me show you again. Keep in mind the white squares. If we were to connect each one of these squares, see the line?
Yeah. And for listeners, I'm going to make sure that if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else that supports episode-specific cover art, you'll be able to see an image right there in the app. Otherwise, check links in the show notes.
If we were to connect the dots, but in this case, connect the squares, the white squares, we form his signature. It's there. Now, if we were to look at the signature from a semiotics perspective, semiotics meaning using
the study
shape.
of signs and signifiers, right?
Exactly. So when we see a hexagon, we automatically think of a stop sign. So if we isolate the algorithm, right, and draw corresponding squares around them that are color-coded to resemble each letter of his name, and then we were to make a transparency of that, and then you were to overlay that onto his other compositions, you will see his signature. It is the generative mechanism of his paintings, but it's not just linear. It's not just going to be, okay, here it is. Sometimes it's inverted. You have to flip it upside down. Sometimes it's scattered around. This enters the mathematical field of topology, where you can take a shape and bend and stretch the shape and twist it around, but you're still going to have this shape because it still exists within the same topological space. And what you then have is basically it becomes like it's a generative mechanism of his paintings. Why he did this, I'm often asked, and I wanted to point this out, why did he do this? And I've asked cryptologists, I've asked many different people, and I think it has something to do with like a watermark, maybe a kind of megalomaniacal, I don't know. It could be, it's got to be ego because he's got his name here. There it is. And what I can't figure out is, you see, I'm not an art person like Kyle. I never even knew who this guy was, a year ago. But when I first started looking at his other paintings, I could immediately see the encryption. There must have been hundreds of millions of people who have seen his works in posters, in movies like Godard's film, stamps, postage stamps. They're highly circulated, and nobody could see it. And that's what I don't understand. So in a way, he was like, de Staël was like a magician who just only showed his audience what he wanted his audience to see.
What I love about this, what really like draws me into this, is when I first saw the image of the blue squares and the different intensities of it, it felt to me like a standard color study of just like what will make certain hues pop out and recede, and playing with that sort of thing. And I could see it as like just experimenting with colors and saturation. I could see it as an abstracted composition. But then as you start to explain that, and I know a lot of other people feel the same way, I really love something that has more to it. Like, I've always told people I am not a particularly talented artist. I am not a very creative guy. I'm a systems guy. And so when I see something like that and you wonder, like, why would you do that? To me, it just screams, he found a schema. He found a system in order to create. And I've known a lot of people who have had all sorts of different, let's say, superstitious beliefs. Like for probably about 3 years, I used the same brush for every painting that I created. And I had this idea that, like, if I never clean my brush and I'm using this brush every single day and it stays wet from the oils, so it's still moving, then a little piece of paint from my first work is still carried on, and it unifies the whole collection of my body of work. And that was just like the let's face it, ridiculous way that my 20-year-old self thought about stuff. But it felt good in my head to have that, and to have that common element that was like, this is my thing. And I think artists always have to have their thing. They're drawn to something. And I would say, yeah, the like putting your signature and your name in everything feels a little bit, egotistical in a way, but also like that's what artists do. Their whole job is to reflect their unique insights into the subject and put their stamp on the painting. And whether you're doing that literally with your signature and your name in the work, or you've developed this style of, dots of paint that no one else is doing. Like, you look at a Monet and you're like, well, nobody else was painting in that way at that time, at least. It seems like that's what artists are trying to do. They're trying to carve out a niche. They want to have something that's their calling card, because as much as it's a fun and creative job, it is also a job. And the way they market their work is by having something that people can look at and say, that's a de Staël, you have to have something that separates you from the competition. And what better than your name? I mean, I love the almost directness of it, even though we're talking about how it's all this hidden stuff and you have to have the key to get it. It's like, it's also like very direct. And I kind of love that about it.
Right. And it's to, in a way, become typecasted, I guess. You paint everyone knows, oh, well, that's a Kyle Wood, of course, so because of how it looks, we become identified with it. But I wanted to also add that even with the algorithm from the seascape, which I have, which he also called his soul, he also called it the key in French. Also, the color of the painting is the same color of his eyes. So it's something else to add to it. Also, for instance, he uses geometry such as the pentagon or the pentagram to be a placeholder for the letter E in his name. So whenever you see, a shape that resembles a pentagram or a pentagon, or the arrangement of objects, we can proliferate the algorithm of the seascape to his figurative works, such as he'll have groupings of 5 bottles. Why 5? There are 5 letters in Stahl. Why are they, also the groupings of the 5 bottles will actually, if you trace the 5 bottles, they'll form a pentagon. Again, the number 5. So that's another thing to look for. But also, again, with those 5 bottles or other 5 objects, you'll also see 2 insignificant objects, which represent the diareses, which are the 2 dots over his E. He was very, assertive about putting those 2 dots there, as you'll see in his works and other images that I'm sure Kyle will share.
That's interesting, the way that he's sort of generalizing that to become symbolic. But like I say, it feels like it's almost, he started to find some success and he realized, like, once he's cooking, keep that recipe going. He's got those different symbols, those different elements. I almost would liken it to the way that I've always been taught certain compositional guidelines. You use the rule of thirds, you do whatever to make it more active and dynamic. And once you find that formula, I think you start to repeat it. And I think it's kind of, it's a little bit funny that, like, it's his name, but I think, there's that whole saying that all art is in some ways a self-portrait.
Absolutely. You put your soul into it. You think about it, it's like you're staring into a mirror, like a black mirror or something that artists would use to rest their eyes with. But here you are actively engaging of a canvas, but that canvas is also engaging you because there's physics behind that canvas. There's forces, there's drying, there's curing, just atmospheric conditions, so on and so forth, especially for plein air. So it's almost like a battle that you have. Oh, I don't have it just right yet. It's got to be like this. And what de Staël used to do, he used to grab these big palette knives, and he would work the paint because he was aerating it. He wanted it to oxidize faster so it would stick better, and he can manipulate it, like a modeling clay or something to that effect, to bend to his will.
Yeah, and you can see, you kind of get that sense from just how heavy the impasto was on those paintings. Like you see those blocks of colors, like it is almost as much about the texture of the surface as it is about the color in some ways.
Absolutely.
So I guess now to just wrap this up, as you're looking at his work, what do you think is sort of the main takeaway that you have to this piece? I mean, obviously you've carried it with you. Your family has brought it with them and held on to it for decades and decades. And, what do you see in the piece, and what does it evoke in you, and what do you think others could glean from looking at these works?
As a fellow child of the 80s, I referred to this painting as the Tetris painting because of the squares. That's what I called it in my mind when I was a child. I still call it that. I call it the Tetris painting. And I remember, there's a little Tetris paint, and so, and like the game, you're fitting pieces into a puzzle to solve the game, to solve it, right? And funny enough, the inventor of Tetris, who was also a Russian, and Nicolas was Russian-born and of French-Russian aristocracy. It was just, I thought it was pretty funny how I was right back then as a child, but so far away at the same time, that associating it with a game developed by a Russian, and then here we have a Russian's painting practically, which in a way has become a game. It's come full circle.
And as I look at it, I almost think, along similar lines, it's almost like there's this game to it, but to me, it's just like this thing that seems simple and playful. Like my first glance, it felt like a simple study, experimenting with materials. As you explained it, it's that aha moment for me that even the things that seem so simple and basic, there's so much more lurking beneath the surface. There is so much more thought and effort that goes into it than so many of us ever appreciate. And with Nicolas de Staël being such a in some ways tragic and tortured figure, from what I've read of his biography, he suffered from a lot of depression. And I know certainly at this time, I know there are a lot of people, as it's November 2024 as we're recording this, there are a lot of people who are very upset and facing a winter that we're going to be deprived of sunlight, and people feel sadness over that. I think it's always helpful to remind all of us that, we see, feel, and experience 100% of our own struggle and see only the smallest bit of other people's. And so be kind to each other, be generous to each other, and look for the good and look for the things to appreciate.
Absolutely, Kyle. And that's two interesting points you brought up about how we carry our depression with us, but we hide it. Like Nicholas hid his encryption in something simple, if you will. But also I wanted to elaborate that I think because of the simplicity of the work, he also thought that, well, this is just way too simple. I need to figure out a way how to complicate it in order for me to self-rewarded and everything, or gratified about his works. So it's almost like his encryption, the cryptography behind his paintings, is anecdotal at times to his actual artwork.
Yeah, and I think there's something to that. I mean, we always need something more. We're always looking for more frontiers to explore. And I think once you start to realize like, oh, the aesthetics are fine, I need something more. I think that's why artists evolve the way they do. Like, he started off doing stuff that was more representational. And then as you gain the skill to do that competently, you start thinking like, well, maybe I can go a little bit more conceptual with this. And then, well, now I feel like I know how to get colors and textures the way I want. I need something more. I need to encrypt something. I need to hide something in here that will be that Easter egg for people to discover and appreciate and enjoy. And I would say he's probably not the only artist who's doing that kind of thing. And I would encourage you to go on a hunt through your local museum and see what hidden details you can discover and enjoy about works of art that maybe went unnoticed before.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. Once again, my guest, Patrick Quéré. I really appreciate your taking the time to share your insights into De Staël.
My pleasure, Kyle. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much. And thank all of you.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.